Tales of Arise, kind of a weird title, is the 17th entry in the Tales of franchise, a series of JRPGs with real-time action combat. I like the Tales games. A lot of them aren't that great. It takes 80 hours before the combat in Tales of Vesperia gets really good, and Tales of Graces has kind of a shitty, dumb story. Tales of the Abyss, a game I love, has honestly a solid 15-hour chunk in the middle that probably could have been condensed to 2 hours. And it also has a weird mechanic that you're probably never gonna utilize in any meaningful way during your entire first playthrough. And then you have Tales of Berseria, where the combat is honestly just kind of a nightmare because you have to cross-reference 20 fucking resistances and weaknesses with your arts. It's safe to say that, each Tales game has its flaw. Your average Tales game probably has at least one thing you'll need to look up a guide for because it's so convoluted and insane you have no hope of figuring it out on your own. In spite of this, I still enjoy the series quite a bit. Graces has one of my favorite combat and progression systems in any action RPG, and Abyss has one of my favorite cast of characters in any game at all, really. The combat has its novelty. It's heavily inspired by 2D fighting games, but the characters and how well realized the characters are what have always hooked me in the franchise. JRPGs have a tendency to kind of forget about their supporting characters and have them just kind of awkwardly stand around during major story sequences. But the Tales games do an excellent job making sure all of the characters feel thoroughly developed and meaningfully involved in every story beat along the way. The Tales games pull this off with the delicacy of a fucking sledgehammer, developing its characters with metric shit tons of dialogue and character interactions that play out in ultra-low budget cutscenes called skits. It's nothing fancy or advanced, but it works. It works really well, actually. Tales of Arise seemed like a landmark title. It's the first entry that doesn't look like a PS2 game anymore, and there is a decent break from the last one. It's also about racism, one of the 2 things Tales games are about, and the ones about racism are pretty good. Needless to say, I was pretty excited for this. I actually first got into the franchise because of the trailer for this game. So did it live up to the hype? Tales of Arise takes place on Dana, a planet enslaved by a bright-eyed race called Renans who come from outer space. They harvest their astral energy and keep them as slaves. The world is split into 5 regions, all ruled by Saturday morning cartoon villains and a really hot ethnic twink who's definitely not racist. You play as Alphen, a slave with an iron mask who can't feel pain. His intro is him saving a slave kid from being abused by stepping in front of the cudgel mid-swing. This sums up Alphen's character pretty well, to be honest. He's not a bad protagonist by any means, but there sure ain't a whole lot going on with him. He's got a tiny arc later on, but for the most part he's pretty static. A typical goody two-shoes kind of guy. He's not bad. I like him. The production value is mwah. Most Tales games are pretty low budget, but right from the get-go it's clear that they had at least a little bit more money and time to make this one. There's some pretty bad texture pop in and plenty of jank in there, but all things considered, it looks nice. There's a nice kind of watercolor shader thing going on that looks great. You get a little taste of the first area, Xillia, in this opening. There's a lot of fire and Alphen doesn't like being a slave. Understandable. Eventually you come across Xion, a woman who electrocutes anyone who touches her. They make kind of an unlikely pair, huh?
A sword that sears the hand of he who wields it, and a healing art to mend. A man numb to pain, and a woman whose very touch deals nothing but.
Okay, alright, settle the fuck down. Throughout this area, you get a pretty good idea of the rhythm the rest of the game will pretty rigidly follow. Run through an outdoorsy area that connects to a city, go in the city, get some subquests, get directed to the dungeon, do the dungeon, face the Lord, move on to the next region. Tales games are normally pretty slow, but the pace is brisk here. It's nice, but it also means the characters receive a lot less downtime than usual, but I'll get into that later. For now, let's just talk about the combat. The Tales games have gone through a couple different combat systems. Originally, you had regular attacks and arts. Arts consume TP, sort of like MP in most JRPGs. I've never understood why you'd put a limit on your ability to combo in a combo-based action game. Eventually, you'll just start whacking enemies with basic attacks over and over again until you come across a consumable, and that's no fun. MP management in a turn-based game promotes tactical use of spells. Sure, you could nuke every random enemy, but then you'd have no magic for the boss. So you gotta figure out the most efficient way to kill random enemies without burning through all of your shit. This doesn't work in Tales though, because it's a combo-based action game. The most efficient way to kill enemies in a combo-based action game is to build combos with moves that complement each other. This is also just where the fun of a game like this comes from. Designing the combat system in a way where you'll eventually run out of your ability to do so makes it feel like you should use your arts sparingly and only when they're needed. But the enemy and encounter design, and even just the fundamental nature of real-time combat, doesn't suit this type of resource management. You could feasibly kill everything with just your basic attacks, but it would take forever and be boring. Reserving the fun part of the combat for just bosses or certain enemies is lame. This is a system that suits tactical turn-based games well, but not so much real-time action games. Just imagine if you eventually ran out of TP in Devil May Cry and just couldn't use your launcher anymore. They wanted some kind of resource management component. They should have designed it on a more moment-to-moment level where you run out of that resource for your given combo. None of this really ends up mattering anyway, since you can carry so many consumables to replenish TP. Resource management can totally be implemented into an action game in a fun way, but this just isn't that. Graces, the best Tales game, introduced a CC gauge. This gauge controlled how many arts you could chain together. Instead of having regular attacks and arts, you just have two different kinds of arts. All of the tactics belong to the moment-to-moment combining of your vast arsenal of moves, rather than managing a slowly dwindling resource that doesn't want you to have too much fun. This suits an action game a lot better if you ask me. Some people don't like how restrictive CC is, claiming that they can't make big combos in the early game. Arise makes the pretty smart move of going somewhere in the middle. So here you have normal attacks and AG, which limits how many arts you can chain together. Arts are bindable to face buttons and cost either 1 or 2 AG, so you don't have to do on-the-fly mental math to pull off a simple combo. Admittedly, it's a good compromise for accessibility, ensuring you can pull off cool combos while not being too punishing for the average player. Most Tales games use the linear motion battle system, which means you're locked onto a 2D axis toward your enemy, but you can free run if you hold a certain button. This one is designed like an actual game though, where movement just works. I actually thought it was really charming how the movement worked in the earlier Tales games. It adds an interesting dynamic you don't really get in any other action RPG. This franchise has been around for a very long time though, and it's controlled like this for a very long time as well. I don't blame them for going for a more traditional movement style at this point. It suits the game's combat system too. Arise has a very free-form and improvisational combat system. Previous games had a lot of weird limitations on what you could combo into what. Most of the early games were just 3 regular attacks, a base art, then an arcane art, and that was it for the vast majority of the game. Skills would open this up, but not by that much. Post-game is where it would really open up, but that's after like 60 hours of playtime. Tales has always struggled with its attempts at reconciling its combo-based action goals with its RPG goals. Progression systems operate way too slow for the real-time combat. Enemy variety is too low for the extremely long lengths these games have. Friendly AI consistently gets in the way of pulling off impressive combos. Stats get in the way of combo potential as well. Bosses require extensive micromanagement of the friendly AI, interrupting the flow of the real-time combat. I know I'm sounding kind of down on Tales combat, but I find a lot of the games pretty enjoyable gameplay-wise. I'm more so articulating how a lot of these issues arise from the fact that these games are trying to do two very different things at once. The RPG elements included end up detracting from the core gameplay, but there are plenty of games that are more deliberate with what to include so as to avoid this sort of thing. What I'm getting at here, and why I'm rambling like a deranged JRPG grandpa, is that Arise streamlines and simplifies the Tales formula in a lot of really smart ways. There's no convoluted equipment system. This horrible nightmare is replaced with very simple elemental matchups, and there's a tried and true dodge roll mechanic that everyone is familiar with. Arise makes the Tales franchise much more accessible in deliberate ways that don't detract from the overall experience. There's an emphasis on stringing long combos right from the start, because if you string a long enough combo together, this happens.
In an instant! Well together.
And it never gets old. The shedding of pointless ancillary mechanics is Arise's great strength, and I hope it's a move the next Tales games follow through with. The fun of Tales of Arise is immediate, pulling off these buttery smooth combos, spiking enemies in the air seamlessly, comboing them back down onto the ground and then back up, is just so damn good. Regardless of depth, the game is just so satisfying on the surface level. I engage with a lot of the post-game content purely because I wanted to. So when I start tearing this combat system apart for 20 minutes straight, just keep that in mind. Firstly, and arguably most importantly, you only have 3 arts. 3! 6, if you want to count your aerial arts, but still, in Vesperia you had 8 starting out. And none of these moves were contextual. You did all of them on the ground. You didn't have to be in the air to use any of them. Not to mention, you could use the shortcuts on the right analog stick for other characters' arts as well, a feature that is just gone here. They removed this feature so that you could get the worst camera in action RPG existence on your right stick. Seriously, this camera fucking sucks, and it sucks for a lot of reasons. It's plopped straight behind Alphen's back, giving you very little sense of depth, making it hard to gauge the spacing between you and your enemy. It's way too close, and you can't see shit in your peripheral vision. It also violently whips and jolts around in a completely disorienting fashion, in a way that no human being would ever want a camera to work. I don't think a single person working on this game thought this camera was good. You could turn off all of this autocorrection shit, but then you're left babysitting the right stick the entire time you're in combat. This becomes a pretty big problem when almost every late game mob has a lunge attack they are very happy to do from off screen. And by the way, there are no audio cues. These attacks literally do not make sound. Not that it would matter, since the game is an incomprehensible mess of flashy spell effects and sloppy, overwhelming sound design. The audio mixing definitely needed work here. Readability is important in action games. Devil May Cry's camera isn't even positioned correctly half the fucking time, but it doesn't matter, because you could avoid enemy attacks blindfolded. Devil May Cry at least had the decency to make sure you could hear all of the enemy attacks even if you couldn't see them. The fact that they knew the camera was this bad and still designed the audio like this means somebody has to die. Sorry, Hirokazu Kagawa. Your time is up. Tales of Graces has one of the best cameras I've ever seen in an action RPG. The distance is fully customizable, so if you feel like it's a little too close, no problem. It's high and offset slightly, creating a great sense of depth between Asbel and his target. It never whipped around awkwardly or suddenly, but moved subtly and smoothly. It was always pointing where you wanted it, so having no control over it was never a problem. In other words, the camera never pissed me off, so it's perfect. The fact that Graces, an entry that came out for the Wii 12 years ago, solved this problem and it's all of a sudden a huge issue again in Arise, really makes my balls ache. The game's got a dodge roll. This is new, for the franchise I mean. It's probably the single most overused mechanic in action RPGs. Seriously guys, bring back the God Hand style dodging and weaving. But it's nice to see Tails modernized a little. If you dodge at just the right time, you get a little slow-mo, some replenished AG, and a counterattack. It's no snap pivot, but it's pretty cool all the same. There's nothing wrong with dodge rolls or anything, of course. Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories has a dodge roll, and that's the best action RPG ever made. The problem with Arise is that it's your only defensive option, meaning every enemy attack in the game is designed to be perfectly dodged, regardless of skill level. You might be thinking, well, good, every attack should be dodgeable, damage should be avoidable. Wrong, dumbass, shut the fuck up. Graces had a wide array of defensive options. 3 types of quick steps avoided different attacks. Side steps avoided vertical attacks and thrusts. Back steps avoided sweeps. Forward steps deflected projectiles. You didn't just pay attention to when an attack happened, but the nature of the attack as well. You could sidestep enemies mid-combo, allowing you to seamlessly reposition yourself so as to avoid enemy retaliation or other enemies' attacks. If you missed time to perfect sidestep, you'd receive the damage but no hit stun, allowing you to retaliate. You also had a block which reduced damage. You didn't feel confident in your ability to perfectly dodge attacks, you could rely on your block, and you absolutely would, since attacks came out fast and were unforgiving. Perfectly dodging attacks was a high skill, high reward move that required knowledge of the enemy's moveset and good reflexes. The game also had Iron Stance. Iron Stance resisted hit stun, allowing you to power through attacks and lay on the offense. You'd still receive damage, but you could stop your attacks from getting interrupted. You activated this with Asbel by unsheathing your sword. This dodging system not only has more thought put into it, but it's also deeper and more rewarding. Perfectly dodging is demanding, and there are other options to utilize if you can't properly use it. Since Arise doesn't have that, its perfect dodge is forgiving. along with its enemy design. This dodging system allowed for a wide variety of attacks and enemy types and graces, but the simplistic dodging in Arise leads to simple enemies with heavily telegraphed attacks that rarely come out in combos, making them all feel too similar and repetitive. Enemies should of course telegraph their attacks, but Arise's enemies don't even feel like they're trying to hit you half the time. Arise's oversimplification of defensive options, not only limiting the amount of them, but also their depth, has a knock-on effect to the whole combat system, including the enemy design, which makes it far less compelling than most other Tales games. As I previously mentioned, you only have 3 art slots in the air and ground, and one of those arts has to be a launcher or you won't have access to half your arsenal. This sucks, obviously, since it limits your combo potential by a lot. You eventually double this number with an item, which definitely helps to make the combat more enjoyable and less repetitive, but still amounts to less arts than you'd have by the end game in Vesperia or Graces. This is only the tip of the iceberg, though. The arts themselves are a greater issue. Vesperia and Graces didn't just have a bunch of arts, they had a bunch of arts that did different things. They had unique qualities and would set enemies up for different kinds of follow-ups. In Arise, your arts can launch enemies, deal damage, and bring Alphen back to the ground. For the most part, they just deal varying amounts of damage and take varying amounts of time to pull off. Since arts are uncancelable, you're going to stick with the fastest and most versatile arts when your slots are so limited, and probably even when you expand them later on. You can experiment with different moves of course, but it's not very rewarding or satisfying. Quite a few arts are redundant or useless. Even the best ones are interchangeable since they don't have any unique qualities that separate them from one another. A lot of the time, the only factor that goes into art selection is going to be the element that's tied along with it, of which Alphen doesn't even have that great of a selection. This doesn't make Arise's combat bad or anything. You're still going to experiment to see which moves flow well, and finding 2 arts that complement each other is cool, but this is such a huge downgrade from what the games have had historically. I should want to use different arts because new moves are exciting and expand my options, not because I'm bored of looking at the same animations over and over again. I would still rather engage with Arise's combat than Symphonia's or something, since depth-wise, there's not much of a difference between the two and Arise feels way better. The way enemy states work has also been changed for the worse. Enemies no longer receive hit stun until you fill up an invisible break meter. The lack of feedback means you'll whack away unsatisfyingly at a brick wall until they finally start receiving hit stun. Enemies can arbitrarily exit this break state and interrupt your combo unless they're in the air, so once you break an enemy, you always want to launch them. Enemies also have a stagger state distinct from their break state. Staggering an enemy or a boss makes them play out a canned animation where they crouch to the ground and don't react to getting hit, which is unsatisfying. Staggering enemies is mostly tied to your penetration stat. Since there's no feedback or meter letting you know when an enemy will get staggered, this is yet another mechanic that's hard to meaningfully engage with. Endgame and postgame, your penetration stat will be so juiced you can frequently stagger, but since enemies don't react to getting hit in this state, it's hard to combo them in fun ways. The way these systems work is antithetical to the type of action game Tales of Arise is. In something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, a more tactical action RPG, staggering enemies this way was fun because it required specific strategies, and stagger conditions were different for every enemy. Since staggering enemies is mostly a stat game with little strategy involved, it doesn't add anything to Tales of Arise besides making its brand of combo-based action feel limp and unsatisfying. I mentioned the freeform and improvisational feel Arise's combat has earlier, but due to a series of weird miscalculations and bad ideas, your combos play out very rigidly for a pretty big chunk of the game. You have 3 normal attacks and AG. Your normal attacks reset when you go into the air, meaning you have 3 aerial normal attacks as well. You want long combos because you'll get the boost strike as a reward, dealing huge damage and most likely killing your target. If you repeat arts in a chain, it does less damage each time. So, exhaust your ground combo, exhaust your ground arts, exhaust your aerial combo, exhaust your aerial arts, use a boost attack to extend your combo, or use a boost strike if you manage to fill the gauge. Aerial combat isn't an option for you to utilize or a tool to use deliberately, it's just something you have to do for every combo. In Kingdom Hearts, I would sometimes stay in the air for a whole fight, never even doing ground combos, and then with other enemies I might stay on the ground mostly. The fact that this kind of variation isn't an option because of this confluence of mechanics in Arise is pretty disappointing. You don't go into the air because you want to, you go because you have to. Half your options are up there. Optimal play is exhausting all of those limited options for the longest combo you can get. Vesperia's Fatal Strike is reminiscent of this, except it required more effort to pull off and had way more going on. There's no risk-reward dynamic with boost strikes. They're an inevitability if you engage with the combat system on even the most basic level. Stringing together a long combo won't even guarantee a boost strike, since the gauge can reset itself at seemingly random points mid-combo. These happen more frequently when an enemy is low health, and you aren't even required to string together a smooth combo. As long as you're laying on the offense, you'll probably get it. One thing I've neglected to mention so far are the boost attacks. Alphen's downs enemies instantly and deals some pretty decent damage. Everyone else's does the exact same thing, but only sometimes. This leads into the core tactical component of Arise, which plays out like a glorified game of Bop It. The game tells you what button to press and when to press it, and then the thing happens. It kind of sucks. And it takes up like half the fucking controller. So many things could have gone on the D-pad. Different arts presets, a lock-on toggle that doesn't pause the game, triggerable overlimit. But instead, it's devoted to 4 attacks that all do the same thing. Xions can multi-hit a wide area of enemies, and Laws pushes enemies back, but these can't be implemented into your combos in very interesting ways. They are on the right track, though. A game came out recently that solves all of these issues and meaningfully implements its party attacks into the core gameplay. That game being, surprisingly enough, Guardians of the Galaxy. In Guardians, each party member's attack does something distinct to enemies. Groot can tie up and immobilize them, giving you breathing room and an opportunity to attack. Gamora's deals damage to several enemies in a small vicinity. Drax deals heavy stagger damage. You don't use these moves because the game tells you to, you use them because they do something. You might use some more than others depending on your playstyle. And get this, each character has 4 attacks, each with plenty of properties to consider. How much stagger damage does it deal? How many enemies does it target? What's the area of effect? How much health damage does it deal? How long is its cooldown? What other moves does this character have that I won't have access to during that cooldown? This promotes a tactical understanding of each character's moveset. It requires thought, where Arise requires none. Sure, there's a decent amount of pausing in the game, but there's a shitload of pausing and interruptions in Arise as well. So the solution would have absolutely worked. It would have at least been better. Not only would it promote diverse combos, but it would also be meaningfully tactical. In its current state, boost attacks are just a waste of time. Now, we get to talk about Overlimit. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know what the fuck happened here. For anyone who doesn't know, Overlimit is this little meter that fills up in Tales games, and when you activate it, something cool happens. Vesperia's Overlimit was pretty neat. There were different tiers to it that all did different things. Not to mention Tension, which was a skill that would put you into a free Overlimit if you maintained a long enough combo. Overlimit is the source of a lot of genuine depth in Vesperia, since there are so many different degrees of risk and reward here. Maintaining tension is a whole other thing too. Cleverly utilizing Overlimit really blew the lid off your options in Vesperia, and some people just panic popped it and wasted it because they didn't fully understand how to use it. Those people are in luck, because that's all you can do with the Overlimit in Tales of Arise. Continuing its obsession with not telling you anything, Arise has made Overlimit an invisible meter that fills up as you land perfect dodges and take damage. It activates on its own, so you have no control over when you're getting it. Everyone has 0 HP and you need to be on the defensive? Congrats, you just got Overlimit. Run around in circles and heal up as it slowly wastes away. Isn't that awesome? You'll get to utilize it more meaningfully later in the game, but that's only because of skills that fill it up faster. In other words, the chance of it popping in at a good time rather than a bad one are higher. Taking a mechanic that was deep and meaningful with a lot of thought put into it and turning it into some random shit that happens sometimes fucking sucks. Mystic arts are also redundant since you already have the flashy cinematics of the boost strikes. Mystic arts last way too long, and combined with the boost strikes, take control away from you way too frequently. Get ready to see the same Mystic Arts several times over and over again from the friendly AI. Party members like Kisara and Law are almost always in Overlimit at their higher levels. Alright. Let's stop dicking around and talk about the boss fights. These are probably the more interesting part of the game. Remember how I said enemies need to be slapped around a little bit before they start reacting to getting hit? Well, the bosses just don't. They can be staggered or downed, but they are total brick walls otherwise. You will not be inflicting any hit stun on them at all, so get used to it. These big Zoogles have cores, weak points that, when destroyed, down them. Bosses are also susceptible to the boost attack downs from your teammates too, but it depends on the boss how many of these can actually be utilized. A lot of people have criticized the boss design in this game for a variety of reasons. The two major ones are that bosses can't be comboed like previous games and that the boss fights don't test the same skills as the basic encounters. These are both sort of right. While bosses can't be comboed, they do behave predictably. If your accuracy stat was low in Tales of Grace's F, bosses would break out of your combos at random. But since bosses in Arise never receive hit stun and getting long combos out isn't the point of the encounter, this is nowhere near as egregious. In Graces, you played defensively because you had no clue when a boss would retaliate, but in Arise, the lack of hit stun encourages the opposite. Your goal in Arise is to lay on the offense through enemy attacks, seamlessly dodging all of their retaliations. Because they react consistently, it's easy to get into the groove of bullying them once you learn their moveset and how to perfectly dodge all of their attacks. Catching a boss in a vulnerable state, downing them, and then using one of Alphen's insane flaming edge arts, sacrificing every ounce of your health to maximize your damage output, sets my fucking neurons on fire. While the strategic elements of these fights don't stack up to something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, which had a variety of unique stagger conditions for every enemy and boss, it's still very fun. It's a lightweight balancing act that makes up for its lack of depth with flashy spectacle and tactile satisfaction. It could definitely be better, don't get me wrong, but I'd be lying to you if I said these fights weren't a big highlight throughout the game. Mostly. I can forgive large Zoogles and big humanoid bosses for not receiving hit stun, but even slender humanoid bosses react the same way. This means every single boss in the game follows this exact formula and tests you the exact same way. By the end, these fights can get just a bit exhausting, and it doesn't help how much the game reuses bosses as well. If these smaller bosses received traditional hit stun and could get comboed, it would have added some much needed variety to the game. A major oversight to the boss design is how boost strikes were implemented. Rather than rewarding you for long combos, they're given to you for hitting certain HP thresholds, rendering them pointless participation trophies instead of a real mechanic. Smaller bosses with traditional hit stun could have made boost strikes actually matter, which would have tested similar skills to regular encounters, added variety, and just been plain satisfying on their own. I don't mind the brick wall design of these bosses, but having every single boss play out like this is a bizarre choice, especially since this isn't at all how you approach combat during regular encounters. A more pressing issue with bosses is the friendly AI. Friendly AI is awful in this game. There really isn't much else to say about it. Even if you tell them to literally do nothing aside from avoid attacks, they will still find ways to take extreme amounts of damage. Your controls over them are much more limited than they were in previous games. You can't even tell specific members to behave in specific ways. You're only given general controls over the entire party. You want your healer to back off and focus on healing, then your entire party is doing that. You are given a sort of pseudo-gambit system where you can tell party members to do certain things at certain thresholds, but the basic functionality they had in previous games is just gone. This might have something to do with the fact that if you told your entire party to focus on the same target, the boost gauge would fill up instantaneously. If that is the case, all I have to say is that if a mechanic in your game forces you to remove basic functionalities to prevent it from breaking the entire system, it's probably time to go back to the drawing board. Damage your party sustains can be mitigated by using accessories, but this is just a band-aid on a larger issue. It's frustrating having your party members be nothing more than a liability with limited control over them, and it's insulting that this didn't used to be as much of a problem. Tales of Arise has a resource specifically for your party's healing ability called Cure Points. Even if you're no damaging every encounter in a dungeon, you'll eventually have to leave to replenish this because of your parasitic teammates leeching away at an important resource you have. CP also removes obstructions in dungeons for some reason, so this is an even greater annoyance. I'm not sure what the point of Cure Points is exactly. It's a resource that gets steadily sapped as you explore dungeons through no fault of your own that you can easily and quickly replenish at no cost by fast traveling in and out of dungeons. The obstructions you can clear with CP are just single rooms with some random loot. Toward the beginning of the game, you can bypass a single encounter by sacrificing some CP for an alternate route, and this is as imaginative as the game will get with this mechanic. This also only happens 2 or 3 times throughout the entire game. You could say it's an opportunity for your party members to feel useful during dungeon crawling since they'll help clear out obstacles, but it's always just a contextual prompt rather than using their abilities to help out. Small environmental puzzles where you use your party members' abilities to progress would have gone a long way to subtly build up their bond through gameplay, but they couldn't even put that minimal amount of effort into the dungeon design. Instead, it's your typical mediocre Tales dungeon, with a little bit of low-effort set dressing to trick you into thinking they tried to evolve their formula a little bit. All you do is run around some narrow hallways and look for a key to unlock a door to the boss. Even when it isn't a literal key, it's functionally a key. Some later dungeons very blatantly repeat level layouts, with the final dungeon making you go through it backwards for the second half. This isn't the end of the world, but it really starts to wear you down when the overworld sections are designed the exact same way. There's very little scope to these areas. They feel way too condensed and don't contrast enough with the dungeons. While Arise introduces some much-needed streamlining to the Tales formula, it fails to evolve it in any compelling way. For every step forward, there are at least 2 steps back. Established mechanics are made worse, and new ideas conflict with the overall core design, creating an entry that lacks cohesion while also refusing to address long-standing flaws within the series.
We're fighting against anyone who tries to take what doesn't belong to them.
But that's what these Renans are doing. How is that any different?
Because I judge everyone by their own actions. That goes for Danans too. Because at the end of the day, at the root of all evils committed is an individual who committed them.
The Tales series isn't exactly known for its story, which is why the majority of this video focuses on the gameplay. But after wrapping this game up, I absolutely need to talk about it. I have pretty low expectations for a Tales story. As long as it doesn't bother me and the characters are good, I'm set. The story in Arise did bother me though. It bothered me a lot. You cruise through 5 regions of Dana, killing all of their lords and liberating all of their people. Each region is distinct from the other, not only visually but narratively. Caligula is a fiery hellhole where everyone is subjected to hard labor and military occupation. Cislodia is a snowy city where every citizen is constantly monitored and distrusts one another as a result. Eldomenencia sees Renans and Danans integrated in society and peaceful, but with a dark secret. Mahag-Sar has been overrun by its violent revolutionaries, leaving most of the people scrounging around rubble. Ganatheros is an opulent city where the citizens are brainwashed and sacrificing themselves for their lord. There's just nothing to chew on beyond the basic premise of each area. Take Eldomenencia for instance. Renans enslave and exploit Danans and the rest of the world. This is one of the only cities that treats them equally. What would that look like? Sure, they'd get along, but surely there would be pretty big cultural rifts between the two people, right? Maybe there's a subsection of Danans that still resent them. Maybe Renans have little sympathy for their plight. Maybe the court system judges Danans a little bit harsher than Renans. Maybe the equality is surface level, and there are deeper systemic issues at hand. Coexistence between oppressor and oppressed is fertile ground for interesting character interaction and world building. But Arise really rushes you through this area to introduce you to Dohalim and get a convoluted plot about turning the citizens into goop. It just doesn't feel like Arise has much of anything to say about oppression, and ends up treating its core theme more like set dressing. Vesperia isn't necessarily a stunning piece of political fiction, but it dealt with its core idea really well. A Blastia core, these powerful little balls, control the water supply in the lower quarter, the working class's area of Zaphius. A single one of these controls the entire water supply. When it's stolen, it starts flooding the entire lower quarter. When Yuri ascends the stairs into the upper quarter, we see the streetlights littered with the Blastia cores. 1 core per light. It's a small detail, but it's good. Vesperia is about imperialism and its effects on a variety of people. The indulgence of the upper class at the expense of the lower class is just one aspect of that. Tales of Vesperia is a game where you murder defenseless politicians, and it's framed as unambiguously good. That's fucking cool. Characters have pretty extensive back and forths about the nature of revolution and reform. One of the major characters, a cop, wants to reform the Imperial Knights from the inside, and almost succumbs to the very tactics he swore to forbid. It feels like Vesperia has a lot to say about its core idea. It's implemented into its world building and character writing meaningfully, whereas Arise really misses the mark and at times just feels flat out thematically incoherent. Kisara and many other characters sternly believe Danans and Renans should, and also can, coexist. The entire cast, save for Rinwell, agrees, and even Rinwell eventually agrees. The way everyone talks about Renans, you'd think they're just a misunderstood group of people. You'd think that it's just a case of a few bad apples. But no, every Renan believes Danans are subhuman, and believes it morally permissible to treat them like insects. They talk down to you, insult you, and treat you like you're some sort of bacteria in a petri dish. They do this because they're raised in a society that relies on racist institutions to survive. These institutions ensure that the people of Lenegis will always be like this, as long as the institutions exist. After all, how could you justify enslaving a group of people if you saw them as equals? Arise never addresses this. It never talks about how it's functionally impossible to integrate these two groups. Do you think it would have been possible for African Americans to be integrated into society if slavery was never abolished? It took the uprooting of an entire economic system of the South to even begin thinking about integration. And even then, there was a long way to go. But before we even get to the plausibility of integration, why should Renans and Danans coexist? Renans have no right to this land. They stole it and enslaved its inhabitants. Why should any of them get to stay? They literally have the technology to leave. You could argue the occupation has lasted so long that Renans can't just leave, but this is also total shit. If Renans kidnapped Danans and kept them as slaves on Lenegis, it would make a little more sense for Danans to fight for coexistence. They've lived on Lenegis so long, it's their home now too. Being forced back to a planet they've never been to before with cultures they're divorced from would be cruel. But Renans can totally get kicked out of Dana. They don't fucking belong there, and ignore the countless slaves being beaten to death a couple doors down. Fuck them. It feels like the writers for Arise didn't understand their own setting. This isn't the story of two races putting aside their differences to live in harmony. It's the story of a race of people killing their oppressors and liberating their people. I mean, Jesus Christ. The main cast stands around a city where the Lord basically lobotomized his people so they would willingly commit suicide for his cause, and finger wags at them for being too mad at the Renans. It's ridiculous. Kisara is a privileged moron who's willing to excuse slavery because her experiences with it were positive. She ignores widespread systemic issues because it wasn't so bad for her in her hometown. She's eager to make excuses for her oppressors and pretends Dohalim is the rule rather than a very rare exception. I can't help but feel that if Kisara was in Tales of Vesperia, she would be an antagonist, and Eldaman and Sia would be represented negatively rather than positively. The cast itself isn't one of the strongest, but it ain't bad either. They're all pretty likable, aside from Rinwell and Law, who are, at best, just sort of boring. Dohalim and Kisara fare much better. Dohalim's privilege and status are a constant source of tension and humor within the party, and Kisara's characterization as a motherly soldier who cares for all of her friends makes her one of the best characters in the game. Alphen's not one of my favorite Tales protagonists. He's a pretty static character, but he's also very likable and earnest. Shion's initially compelling because of how standoffish she is, but she feels pretty bland after she warms up to the party. They have one of the most prominent and least compelling romances of any Tales cast as well. Alphen fighting through the pain of touching Shion to give her a hug or save her is compelling the first time it happens, not the following 20. Personality-wise, I do like most of these characters though, honestly. Some of the post-game skits get pretty goofy and fun with them, and I definitely look back on the characters fondly. They are unfortunately very underwritten though. Each one has an open and shut arc that concludes a handful of scenes after they begin in their respective region and then have no substantial growth afterwards. Rinwell is a great example of this. Her arc is that she acts really annoying the entire game until it's revealed her family was killed by a specific Renan lord, which is why she harbors so much disdain for them. Just a handful of cutscenes later, Rinwell is shown the error in her spiteful ways and starts behaving more amicably. Law leaves the resistance to join the bad guys because of his daddy issues, but completely resolves his melodramatic moping by the end of the snow zone, becoming a goofball for the rest of the game. Alphen momentarily falters as a heroic symbol when he learns his tragic backstory, but within the very next cutscene he's back to good old Alphen. These characters don't feel like they go through gradual change throughout their journey, emerging from the other side as different people. Their growth feels sporadic and sparse. The plot and character writing are bare bones, and thematically Arise is at best incoherent. I haven't even touched on part 2 of the game yet, which sees an enormous drop in quality. I won't dwell on this too much because I strongly suspect the unfinished nature of the later content in the game is because of COVID impacting the development. If you've played it, you know exactly how bad it is. Some people downplay how awful it gets, but I think the flaws are unignorable and sour the experience even further. Tales of Arise isn't a bad game. It's a perfectly fine action RPG. If it's your first Tales game or one of your first, I think you'd probably like it. For someone who's played many previous entries, it's a frustrating experience that fails to capture the appeal of the series, and only gets worse the deeper you dig. While I think Arise makes some improvements over the last 2 entries, it still continues a trend of careless design and an insistence to iterate on ideas that were executed much better 10 years ago, making it fall flat as the 17th entry in a long-running franchise.